Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the weeds of large language models, looking beyond just the end result.
hmm
We're diving into something called learning dynamics, essentially, how these models actually learn and change during that fine tuning process.
Right. Forget just the snapshot at the end. We want to see the movie step by step.
Exactly. And we know you want to get up to speed quickly, but also properly understand this stuff. So this deep dive is designed for that cutting through the noise to get to the core insights.
Especially focusing on the innovative findings, the real moments coming out of recent research.
Okay, so where are we getting these insights from today? What's our source?
We're basing this on a really interesting research paper. It's titled Learning Dynamics of LLM Fine-Tuning, and it was presented at ICLR 2025.
ICLR, okay. Solid source. And what's our main goal here, our sort of mission for this dive?
Well, the mission is to really unpack how LLMs evolve during fine-tuning. Using the lens of this paper, we especially want to highlight the novel ideas, maybe some counterintuitive stuff they found.
Things really innovation, improving alignment, perhaps.
Precisely. It's about understanding the step-by-step influence of the training examples on what the model predicts. That's the core concept.
So moving beyond just looking at performance metrics to understanding the mechanics of learning.
Exactly. How does learning example A affect the prediction for example B, and why?
Got it. So how does the paper actually formalize this? How do they break down this step-by-step influence?
Yeah, this is where it gets quite innovative. They managed to decompose the change in the model's prediction, like how its guess changes, after seeing one training example into three key mathematical terms.
Okay, three terms.
And what's really neat is that this framework works across different fine-tuning methods. It gives a unified view of, say, supervised fine-tuning, SFT, and preference tuning methods like DPO.
Ah, okay. So it's not just separate analyses for each technique anymore. This provides a common language.
That's the idea. It's a more fundamental look underneath the specifics of the algorithm. Most analogies tend to focus on, the training targets or just the final model state. This is different.
Interesting. Can we look at the equation, maybe a simplified version to get the intuition?
Sure. For a simpler case, the change in the log probability, think of it as the change in confidence for an output y given input, looks something like this. A log t yxo is approximately a times et times kt times gt.
Okay, minus eta akg. Let's break that down. Eta is just the learning rate, right?
Yep, E is the learning rate, standard stuff, controls how big a step the model takes.
Okay. What about a axo?
At relates to how confident the model already is about its prediction for OXO. If the probability distribution is sharp, very peaked, A is higher.
Got it. More certain, higher A. Now, KTT XO, that sounds important. The kernel.
That's the empirical neural tangent kernel, or ENTK. This is crucial. It basically measures the model's learned similarity between the input we're evaluating, XO, and the input it just trained on, XO.
Learn similarity, so it changes during training.
Exactly, that's a key point. The NTK isn't fixed. It evolves as the model learns. A bigger kernel value between two inputs means learning from one has more potential to influence the other.
Okay, that makes sense. Dynamic similarity. And the last piece, GT.
GT is determined by the loss function you're using. It provides the force and direction for the update. For SFT with the usual cross-entropy loss, GT basically points from the model's current prediction towards the correct answer, U.
So GT is like the error signal telling the model how to adjust based on that specific training pair?
You got it. It encodes the objective of the specific fine-tuning task.
Right. Could you maybe walk us through a simple example, like the MNIS digit recognition thing? How would learning a 4 affect other digits based on this A, K, G?
Okay, yeah, MNNS is good for intuition. Imagine you show the model A4, that's SOU. GT points towards 4. Now, consider another input, XO.
Okay.
If XO is also a 4, the ENTK, KT between them will likely be large. So learning the first 4 strongly pulls up the probability of XO also being identified as 4.
Makes sense. Similar things influence each other strongly.
Right. Now, if XO is, say, a 9 that maybe looks a bit like a 4, the KT might be smaller but still positive. So the 9 might get a small nudge towards being classified as a 4.
Okay, a weaker influence.
And if XO is a 1, which looks nothing like a 4, KT would be very small, maybe close to 0. So learning the 4 has almost no effect on the probability of the 1. The C term pulls up the 4, but the KT term dictates how much that pull transfers to other inputs.
And presumably it pulls down the probability for other digits for the original 4 input.
Well, the GT term specifically pushes towards the target U, How it affects other potential outputs is implicitly handled by the probability normalization, but the primary force is towards the target label.
Got it. That clarifies the mechanics. Now, applying this to LLMs, that sounds way harder. High dimensions, sequences.
Oh, absolutely. It's a big jump. The sheer size of the vocabulary, the fact that language is sequential, each word depends on the previous ones, these are major challenges.
So how did the researchers tackle the sequential nature? That seems particularly tricky for this kind of step-by-step analysis.
They used a clever trick. They incorporated the teacher forcing mechanism, which is often used when training sequence models, into their analysis.
Teacher forcing, where you feed the correct previous token as input for the next step.
Exactly. By doing that in the analysis setup, they could essentially bundle the autoregressive dependency into a modified ENTK term. So KT now considers the similarity between whole sequences or partial sequences, denoted as Shuki.
Ah, so they adapted the kernel definition itself to handle sequences. That's quite an elegant methodological step.
It is. It allows them to apply the same core decomposition framework, even with the complexity of language generation.
Okay, so with that adaptation in place, what did they find specifically when looking at supervised fine-tuning SFT?
Right, for SFT, the decomposition looks similar, but GT is specifically the SFT gradient. GT, SFT, AAE. It points from the current prediction to the target token sequence.
And what were the key observations or maybe surprising findings there?
One really interesting finding was about how SFT affects responses that are similar to the target response, but not identical. Let's say you train on prop su, good answer y plus u.
Okay.
Initially, the probability of other good answers, maybe just rephrased versions of y plus u, also increases. That makes sense, right? Similar things should get boosted.
Yeah, due to the ENTK similarity we talked about.
Exactly. But here's the counterintuitive part. They found that if you keep training only on that specific pair su, y plus u, the probability of those other good, similar responses eventually starts to decrease.
Wait, decrease, even if they're perfectly valid answers and weren't penalized. Why?
The explanation from the learning dynamics is that the direct pull towards the exact sequence y plus u, driven by the GTSFT term, becomes overwhelmingly strong over time.
Ah.
This direct pull starts to dominate the indirect positive influence it was initially spread to similar responses via the ENTK. So the model gets increasingly focused on the precise training example it saw.
It overfits to the specific wording, essentially losing probability mass for equally good alternatives.
You could see it that way, yes. It highlights a potential downside of very targeted SFT. It might narrow the model's acceptable response space too much.
Does this connect to any practical issues we see with LLMs?
Potentially, yes. The paper draws a line to certain types of hallucinations. They observe that training on C, y plus u, could sometimes increase the probability of a preferred response y plus j for a completely different prompt xj.
How? The prompts are different.
The NTK might still find some subtle similarity, maybe in the underlying concepts or structure, between u and xj. So the positive influence from GTSFT for y plus u might leak just a little bit over to y plus j via this cross-prompt similarity captured by KT.
So learning to answer question A might inadvertently make the model slightly more likely to reuse parts of answer A when answering unrelated question B.
That's the idea the dynamics suggest. It offers a mechanism for how SFT could potentially reinforce certain patterns that lead to inappropriately transferring information between contexts.
That's a fascinating dynamics-based view on a type of hallucination. What about that point on ChatGPT rephrases being seen as similar?
Yeah, they noted that the ENTK often registered a very high similarity between different human-written or even ChatGPT-generated rephrasings of the same core answer.
Suggesting?
It suggests the model might develop preferred ways of expressing things, sort of like linguistic fingerprints. Learning one phrasing makes it much more likely to generate other closely related phrasings, maybe reflecting biases learned during pre-training or alignment.
Interesting internal biases. Okay, let's switch gears to direct preference optimization, DPO. How does the learning dynamics framework shed light on its behavior?
So DPO works by trying to increase the likelihood of a preferred response, y plus u, and decrease the likelihood of a less preferred one compared to some reference model.
Right, using human preference pairs.
Exactly. When you decompose the DPO update step, you GT terms, one positive push for Y plus U and one negative push for YO, GT DPO badge. The strength depends on how well the model already separates them, a value A.
Okay, so pushes and pulls based on preference. What's the novel insight here?
The big one is something they call the squeezing effect, particularly with off-policy DPO.
Squeezing effect sounds tight. What does it mean?
It means that prolonged DPO training can actually start to decrease the probability of almost all responses, sometimes even the preferred ones eventually, concentrating probability mass very heavily onto just the single most likely output sequence.
Whoa, why does that happen? Why does pushing down on the bad answer hurt everything else?
Think about where YU, the less preferred response, often sits in the probability distribution. It's usually already in a low probability area, right? The model already thinks it's unlikely.
Yeah, usually.
So when DPO applies a strong negative gradient, GT-DPO, to this low probability region, it doesn't just push down YU. Because probability has to sum to 1, that negative pressure effectively pushes down the probability mass across a wide range of other outputs as well, forcing the remaining probability to concentrate intensely on whatever the model currently deems most likely, what's called Y.
So the negative gradient in that low probability tail has broad, unintended consequences, squashing the distribution towards the peak.
Precisely. It squeezes the probability mass. And this can lead to the model becoming repetitive, less diverse, maybe generating the same phrases over and over, which is a known potential issue with DPO sometimes.
That's a really clear mechanistic explanation for that observed DPO behavior. Did they see evidence of this?
Yes, their experiments confirmed it. They tracked the probability of the greedy decoded response, the single most likely sequence, during DPO, and it shot up very rapidly, much faster than other probabilities, indicating that squeezing effect was happening.
Critical insight. But the paper didn't just point out the problem, right? They proposed a fix based on this dynamic understanding.
They did, and it's actually a really innovative, simple, and maybe even counterintuitive idea flowing directly from the analysis.
Okay, intriguing. What is it?
To mitigate the squeezing effect, they proposed augmenting the initial SFT data, instead of just training on prompt C, preferred answer Y plus U.
Yes.
They suggested also including the less preferred answer prompt SU, dispreferred answer YO in the SFT phase.
Wait, you teach the model the bad answer during SFT. Why would you do that?
It sounds weird, I know, but the rationale comes straight from the dynamics. By deliberately showing the model YO during SFT, you actually make it more probable, at least initially. You pull up that region of the probability space.
Okay, so you make the bad answer slightly less unlikely before you even start DPO.
Exactly. So when you get to the DPO phase and apply that negative GT DPO gradient to YO, it's no longer pushing down on a super low probability region, a deep valley.
Because SFT already lifted that valley floor a bit.
Precisely. So the negative gradient has less of that broad squeezing effect on all the other outputs. It's a clever preconditioning step.
That is clever. It directly targets the mechanism they identified. Did it work in practice?
They tested it quite thoroughly. Using the QN 1.5 model and the Anthropic HH dataset, they compared a baseline, SFT on just Y plus B, then DPO, with their method, SFT on both Y plus and Y, then DPO.
And the results?
The learning dynamics analysis during the experiments matched their hypothesis. With their method, the probability of YU did indeed increase during SFT, and crucially, during the DPO phase, the squeezing effect was much weaker.
How do they measure weaker squeezing?
They saw a slower decay in the probabilities of other reasonable responses, and the probability of the single argmax, most likely response, didn't climb nearly as sharply. The distribution remained broader.
Okay, the dynamics looked better. Did it actually lead to better alignment according to human preferences?
Yes, that was the key outcome. They used strong models like GPT 3.5 Turbo and Claude Haiku to evaluate the outputs. The models trained with their augmented SFT data plus DPO method achieved significantly higher win rates against the baseline models.
So the counterintuitive SFT step translated directly into models that people preferred more.
Exactly. It shows that understanding these underlying dynamics isn't just academic. It can lead to practical, innovative techniques for improving these models. That's a major takeaway here.
Absolutely. It really drives home the power of looking under the hood, analyzing the process step by step, rather than just treating the model as a black box and looking at the final output.
Totally. This work gives us explanations for tricky things like why XFT might reduce confidence in good answers, how hallucinations might get reinforced, why DPO can sometimes squeeze diversity out.
And then uses that understanding to build a better training strategy.
Right. It's a great example of theory informing practice in a very direct way.
So for you listening, hopefully this gives you a much deeper, more nuanced grasp of what's actually happening during fine-tuning. It's not just magic. magic. It's this complex dance of influences governed by these dynamics.
Yeah, you're moving beyond just knowing that SFT or DPO works to understanding a bit more about how and why they work, including their potential quirks.
It definitely leaves us with things to think about. Now that we have tools to analyze these dynamics, what else could they reveal?
That's the big question, isn't it? Could we use this to diagnose other weird LLM behaviors? Or design even more refined fine-tuning methods? Think about that squeezing effect. Where else might similar dynamics pop up in AI generation?
Lots to mull over. And of course, if you want the full mathematical details and all the experimental nuances.
Diving into the original ICLR paper is definitely the way to go. It lays out the framework much more formally.
A valuable read for anyone serious about this field.
For sure.
Okay, well, that wraps up our deep dive for today. We've navigated the intricate learning dynamics of LLM fine-tuning and hopefully surfaced some really cutting-edge, innovative insights for you. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.